You're listening to Mission Eve, a podcast that explores the stories of women who are opening the frontier of space to humanity. Your host is Megan Crawford, managing partner of Space Fund, a venture capital firm investing in the space industry. She is a mother, volunteer, founder, and true believer in humanity's future in space. Mission Eve is meant to inspire the girls of today who will be the women of tomorrow, leading our first permanent off-world settlements. Space needs women. Space needs you.
Welcome to Mission Eve. I'm your host, Megan Crawford, and today I am super excited to introduce everybody to Lynne Dittmar. We're so happy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And do you think that had any effect on your interest in space?
I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I grew up in Cincinnati. As a matter of fact, I stayed there for a long time, all the way through graduate school, which was not the original plan, but that's what happened. I don't know if it had an effect on me. I mean, I'm sure it did have an effect on me. It was a Midwestern town with what were colloquially called Midwestern values. I was pretty isolated in the sense that it was definitely white middle class, and that's it. Not that there's anything wrong with white middle class, but that's it. That was so I had to develop openness to different ways of thinking and being over time, which actually was never a problem for me. I've always sort of sought it out. So that's great. I think probably when it came to an interest in space, it's not the where, it's the when. Because like so many people of my cohort, I grew up during the Apollo era. And I was born in 1957, which is the same year as Sputnik. And so I was there, sort of for all the development of it. And I wasn't keenly aware of it when I was much younger. But by the time we were flying sort of the initial missions, certainly by Apollo 8, I remember that very clearly. And then Apollo 11. And it's interesting because as a child, I'm not sure if it was my response to it as much as it was watching my parents' response to it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which was fascinating. And my father was a complete Star Trek nut, and so actually introduced me to Star Trek. And so we sort of had this vision in the family of the future of technology development and where that might take human beings.
Well, the next question I normally ask is, were there any defining moments in your childhood that got you interested in space? So Apollo 8, Apollo 11, tell me a little bit about your memories of those and kind of how they affected you.
Apollo 8, I remember, will certainly remember the photos coming back. I mean, I think anyone that was alive during that period of time does. And frankly, even people who were not alive during that period of time, because the photos are so iconic. I remember very clearly the voices of the astronauts coming back, reading Genesis. And this notion that you had this literally God's eye view, right? Which they were obviously experiencing. Looking back at the Earth and sort of recognizing that it was this little bit of blue amongst, sort of against this very great backdrop, because you could sort of see parts of the moon at various points. And then also just the blackness of space and the idea that human beings were out there looking back, and back is sort of a subjective term, but what I mean, sort of looking at the Earth and
the overview
what did
effect.
That really, the overview effect, what did that really mean? And these were very fuzzy pictures. I mean, this was not, you have them now, they've all been digitized and cleaned up and all that, but right. I mean, but still, I remember the sense that we were someplace else. We were not at Earth. We were at another place. And then Apollo 11, my father made it very clear in sort of the 48 hours leading up to the landing that day or night, time of day did not matter. We were going to be sitting there. And my brother and I both, because we've talked about it over the years, have this very clear memory of being there. We were already dressed for bed, but we were sort of really had this really clear memory of sort of just being plopped in front of the television set to watch, that. And of course, we've all seen Walter Cronkite do this for so many years, replayed, but I think I saw it the first time because we always watch CBS. And just, again, this sense of wonder, And I remember my parents just sort of being dumbstruck. My father was very interested in technology and in flight, and used to tell the story of the first time he heard an airplane, which was around 1932. He was 11 and had run outside to figure out what he was hearing. And looked up and saw this going overhead. And it was the first time he'd seen a plane. And of course, 10 years later, it was in the middle of fighting a war where they were calling in air support.
Right.
But they were, and then my mother, I think, was just interested in the human story of it. She wasn't as engaged, although she became more engaged later. But so both my parents, I think, were really important in just sort of keeping. And it wasn't just that. I mean, they kept us kind of tied into everything that was going on in the world. We were pretty fortunate in that regard.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. Excellent. So, did you want to be an astronaut when you were a kid?
No.
No?
I had no interest in being an astronaut. I wanted to be a singer.
Excellent.
And did develop that capability, and then also wanted to be in musical theater. Eventually, I took a very long and winding sort of course, but no, I thought I continued to be very interested in space, but I didn't see myself as playing a role in it, or playing a role in the industry at all. And I've thought a lot about this question. Was the fact that women were not present or visible generally in that world part of it, that it just didn't occur to me? Or was it that I was interested in other things? I know that I was interested in other things, but I don't know if there was a subconscious thing. I kind of hesitate to say there were, because I think I'd sort of be reconstructing my own history, but I just had other interests, for a long period of time. And it wasn't until, to be honest, graduate school, when I actually started doing research that was related to the FAA, and aviation, that I then started to think about space again. So yeah, so there's a long interval there.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about your education. What did you do for your undergrad?
So my undergraduate, I actually started in broadcasting, and the reason for it is I really wanted to start in musical theater, but I was born with a connective tissue disorder that's chronic and lifelong, and there is no treatment for it. And by the time I got into undergraduate, I had already had 5 knee reconstructions, and I had massive joint issues. And to go into musical theater and to be able to really make a living, you have to be able to dance.
Right.
And it was just clear that I was not going to be able to take the pounding. And so then the other option was sort of like going to classical voice training. Although I was originally trained that way, I had long since sort of embraced what was called the Great American Songbook, essentially big band music in the 20s through the early 50s, and thrown in, pretty much across the board, that kind of stuff for a female vocalist. And so there weren't really majors in that. It was either classical music or musical theater. And I did not have the voice for classical music. And so I was like, okay, that's not happening. So I actually picked broadcasting as a third choice, and kind of a poor third choice. I did it for a year and then thought, and I had been exposed in high school to some work in what we would now call human factors. So I actually switched majors into psychology and found my way into a lab after about a year and started doing a lot of work in human perception and performance. And from there, it turned out, although I could not possibly have seen it at the time, to be a straight line between that initial work and then grad school, which was in experimental psychology, again, focus on human perception and performance. But from there, started to think about how systems are designed and how human beings engage in those systems and work in those systems. And from there, I went to systems engineering. And so it kind of just went from there, right? And so when I applied to graduate school, I actually applied into a program that was a joint program that had clinical work in it. So I did act as a master's level therapist for a number of years, but also was really focused on sort of the interaction between humans and machines. And so that's how that happened.
And, that's something I think people are talking about a lot more today with AI and robotics and everything, but to have that experience for many years, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah. Well, human factors as a discipline as applied to aviation initially was really sort of pioneered by the Boeing company with the development of some just unbelievable flying machines in World War II. And so the discipline had been around for a long time, but you're right, with the advent of computers as aids to a lot of human behavior now, it really, and I was right there in grad school when it had changed. So a lot of my research was actually on display configurations and how we think about those and what the mind can and cannot do with those. And so, yep, it was, and I was working in very early VR. Also, again, still trying to figure out, how do we actually use this stuff? So yeah, that was good.
So what was your kind of terminal degree? What kind of degree did you end up with eventually at the end of your education?
I ended up in a PhD, but PhD is in a major that doesn't exist anymore. It was actually put together for a group of 7 of us that wanted to span clinical work, experimental psychology, and then sort of human factors, systems engineering sort of stuff. And I honestly don't even remember the name of the degree. It might have been called experimental. I'm not sure what the name of the degree is. I should know. If you went and looked me up under the university, you would see a degree in experimental psych, but I can't remember what the thing was.
And what university?
University of Cincinnati.
So you stayed there. You said you stayed in Cincinnati all through.
I had no intention of doing that. And to this day, I always tell people that I'm mentoring, you should move away from where your undergraduate is and go. But in my case, they had put together this major that was really unique. There were only 2 or 3 of them in the country. And so I was already there, and I was already pushing the boundaries of some of the research that I was doing. So research that I was doing was what I would call sort of classical human factors, like looking at the human perception and performance system as it interacts with other systems that are designed sort of out here. But I was interested also in gender differences. And I was also interested in cognitive science issues, which are things like how human beings manage workload and how workload changes depending on the demands of any given task. And then what does all of that tell us about how we should be designing systems for human beings? Very often, you have engineers or computer scientists designing systems to meet a task. And that's fine until you put the human being into the system. And then you find out, oops, maybe it's optimized for the interaction of this machine with this task, but it may not be optimized for the interaction of the machine with the human with the task. And so that's it. That's in a nutshell what human factors is. And so then I just started, it was a natural step to start going to systems engineering. So, yeah.
So what'd you do after grad school? After you got your PhD, what was your first job?
So I always intended to have a part-time clinical existence where I was seeing patients at a master's level. I did not go through the becoming certified at a PhD level because it wasn't one I wanted to do solely. I really sort of saw it as a side gig, right? So I worked with other psychiatrists or psychologists who had the senior level stuff, so I could just do my thing and see patients. But my idea was always to be able to do that and be an academic. That's what I wanted to do. And so when I left graduate school, I started looking for available jobs. And lo and behold, there was one at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, which had immediate proximity to the Marshall Space Flight Center. So NASA. And so I applied. And that's when, it was sort of in the last 2 years of graduate school, because I was doing work that, like I said, was funded by the FAA to look at stuff. And that got me starting to think about space again, because I was hanging out with a bunch of other researchers who were looking at the same sorts of things, but they were looking at them in terms of space systems. So we were all cross-pollinating. So when this job was available, I went ahead and applied for it. And sure enough, within 6 months, I was not only running my lab and the stuff that I was running my lab on, but that I had brought with me, but I was consulting to small companies that were doing work with NASA. Again, largely on sort of human-machine interaction, because that was my key stuff. So that's how that happened.
So then what came next? What was so you're starting to do a little bit of NASA stuff. How did it progress from there?
I started doing more and more NASA stuff. I was doing, I had my academic teaching, and then I was teaching human factors. So I was spending a lot of time sort of split between College of Arts and Sciences, which was where psychology sat, and then the engineering college, which is where systems sat. I had started I was doing sort of straightforward display configuration, gender differences, human perception and performance, kind of modifying displays and sort of seeing what kinds of things I would get. And then started working with these companies. And that led me over to the Human Factors Group over at the Marshall Space Flight Center, which was at that time really interested in the use of virtual reality to see if we could use it as a design tool. That now seems obvious, but this is 1993 and 4. And it was not at all obvious, because VR in those cases was only done through helmets that were wired to motion trackers and used big SGI computers to do rendering. And it was not clear what the real relationship was between what you see in a helmet and the actual world. So if I'm going to be designing for space and I want to use VR to sort of create imaginary worlds or create imaginary designs, and this is real work. I started at Marshall and then took over to Boeing later. And what I'm interested in is trying to figure out, where do I need to put handholds on the outside of a space station to help astronauts move from place to place as they're putting it together? I need to know that the distances that I think I'm seeing or testing inside a virtual reality helmet map to the real world, or else I end up with a model that not only is not relevant or not accurate, but could lead me down a path that's going to cost a lot of money to fix in the real world. So started doing basic research with Marshall on whether or not you could use virtual reality as a design tool. And we started with just real basic stuff like, can you use it to lay out a control system? So we published, or control room. So we published a few studies on that, basically seeing whether or not you could use it and what the sort of limitations were of it as a design field. And so we did a bunch of that. So I sort of continued to work a whole lot in displays, but probably because I'm what's called a systems thinker, I'm interested in how the pieces fit together. I started also getting really interested in what the actual design was going to be for displays for things like payloads and science on board space station. And that eventually took me in a direction where I thought, there's some training mechanisms that are being used to sort of start building on this, and maybe we need to take a look at that again. And I was also talking to the Army about some of these same things. And so I ended up leaving after a lot of thought. It was a hard decision. I ended up leaving academia and starting the first of what turned out to be several companies that was focused on sort of technical consulting having to do with that. And also trying to develop some technologies that would sort of help with training. Although my primary customer was actually the Army, it wasn't NASA, but the Army was also there. Okay, because the Marshall Space Flight Center, for those who don't know, sits on the Redstone Arsenal. Okay, which is Army Arsenal. So they're all in one. Okay, right. Right there in Huntsville. And so I had access to both of those customer bases, and so that's how I got it. And that's when I really kind of made the leap from, it wasn't a leap, it was really just sort of straight line between doing a lot of more psychology work to sort of more design work. It's just evolved over time. Mm-hmm. And I got more and more interested in systems engineering. And then from there, what happened was that Boeing, which had tried to hire me when I was still an academic, came back after I had been doing some work for a couple of years and said, hey. And so we negotiated an agreement, and there I went.
And so then you were at Boeing.
I was at Boeing.
How long were you at Boeing?
I started at Boeing in 97, specifically looking at payloads operations, and which I'd sort of already kind of been looking at, payloads operations, and eventually training. And this was all space station related, but I was doing it as part of an internal think tank. I did not want to come and join a program because I did not want my whole life to be circumscribed by that program. So I was really comfortable coming over and excited to come over and join what was really a think tank. It was called the Advanced Computing Group. And it was essentially just, what can we do with computing?
Cool.
It was very cool.
Yeah.
So can we do design? Can we do operations? What problems can we solve? We would develop technologies in the lab and then test them out. We had robots running all over the place. We were really interested in what is now called ubiquitous computing. But in those days, when you would say ubiquitous computing, people had no idea what you're talking about. Don't forget, this is long before cell phones. This is long before we didn't have handhelds.
Yeah.
And so figuring out how to mount robots with relays so they could talk back and forth like everything else that was in the room. I mean, using VR in some ways that were very interesting. I mean, it was a great playground. And one day, one of the managers came to me and said, hey, since you kind of played in this world before, the space station guys, also Boeing, because Boeing had the contract for development there, the space station guys would like it if you could come over and take a look at some of the stuff that's happening with regard to payloads, operations, and displays and training. And so I said, sure, because I just took it on as another project. And I went over there and started doing all that and immediately started realizing that the pieces were not playing together. And we needed a systems approach to all of it. Started writing white papers. And then before I know it, one of the senior managers for the site showed up and handed me a paper from then astronaut John Young, who was very unhappy about how NASA was conducting its own training preparation for the space station, handed it to me and said, can you do something about this? And that was all she wrote. It was about 6 months later that I got transferred into the space station program. And then another 6 months later, I got sent to Houston on detail. And then another 6 months later, actually 9 months later, that I finally agreed to move to Houston. And within another year after that, I had taken over the mission operations group, which was responsible for laying out what was called the OPO1, which was the flow for doing systems and subsystems integration to put the space station together on orbit. So it was kind of fast from that point forward.
So then you're at NASA, you're fully integrated, you're in Houston. How long were you there?
So I was in that job I was still doing an R&D job. I did an R&D job for a while for station where I was responsible for, it could be argued this is, other than starting my own business, it could be argued that this was my first foray into venture capital. It was institutional venture, which was I was responsible for a while for developing technologies for utilization on board station. And so the way that it worked, and it works this way in a lot of companies, is different companies have IR&D, which is internal research and development fund, and they'd be working on technologies, and those technologies would be brought forward, and we'd sort of make some judgments based on what might be useful for any given program. So in my case, it was station, and so I was responsible for managing that portfolio, right? And my task was to help bring these technologies, develop them to the point where then you could make judgments about whether or not they would find a home on the program. And if not, could you spin them either to another program inside Boeing, or could you spin them outside Boeing? And corporations have this sort of approach. And so I was doing that and then taking over the mission operations group. And so there was about a year and a half where I was doing both jobs, which was exhausting, but also just gave me tremendous insight into the interplay between technology and funding and systems design and systems engineering and large scale systems. And I eventually let go of the IR&D job and stayed with the mission ops job, I guess, until 2002. And by 2002, I was sort of like, okay, I've gotten this where it needs to go. When I took it over, it was over budget and behind schedule. And when I left it, it was on budget and on schedule. And so I actually left human spaceflight and went into business development for a while. And I was really focused on remote Earth observation. And I did that for about a year and a half. And then beginning in 2003, my then husband was deployed overseas. And so I started to think, I have learned, I got the world's best postgraduate education at Boeing. I learned a lot about business. I learned a lot about technology development. I certainly learned a lot more about systems engineering. I learned a lot about management. I mean, I had just really learned, it was tremendous, great experience for me. But I was getting itchy feet because I had interest in things that weren't going to be on Boeing's agenda because they didn't fit their corporate direction. And so I wanted to leave and start again. And the vision for space exploration had just been announced. We'd gone through both a personal loss as well as a professional loss with the loss of Columbia. My husband's best friend was on board. He was the best man at our wedding. and a godfather to my older stepson. And we're not alone in this regard, certainly by any means, but it had refocused me on what does it mean to sort of go forward with space exploration, given the tremendous costs that we had all been reminded of, and what can I do to sort of help that take forward? And while I certainly could have stayed at Boeing to continue doing that, I kind of wanted to go try it on my own. So I left in 2004 on great terms. As a matter of fact, Boeing was my first customer, and set up a consulting firm to sort of go forward and try and explore that a little bit more.
And so tell us a little bit more about the consulting firm and what you did there.
The consulting firm actually still exists, although it's pretty quiet right now, as I'm not working with it. But the consulting firm was set up because, again, you sort of follow a career trajectory. I was doing technical work largely, and then technical management, and then also business development. And some visionary stuff, starting to work a little bit more on where I thought policy needed to go. I had recognized while I was in business development at Boeing that national policy has a tremendous amount to say, as it works all the way down to program structures and business development and what engineers actually end up doing for a living and what scientists end up doing for a living. So it had kind of crept into the back of my mind that what I really needed to do was start angling more to see if I had anything to contribute at that level. But I had a tremendous amount of learning to do. So I kept on working in the area in which I was known, which is, as you develop businesses, there's a thing called adjacency or proximity, which is really important. And I was already known in certain fields. And so a lot of the work that I did initially was business development or sort of helping company structure, lots of young startups, lots of technology companies, but also some large companies who would be interested in doing proposals for what were still largely government programs. So I did a lot of that work. I also did some just pure think tanking, where companies would hire me and sort of ask me to come in and just think as a strategist who had experience in developing technology portfolios, to be able to sort of help them think about, well, does it make sense? There's a thing I used to call entrepreneur's disease, where you have inventors in large part who have brilliant ideas, and they've often created these to solve problems, or to push past what they see as barriers. And they're very innovative and very creative, but they have an implicit faith that, of course, everyone will see it the way that they do.
Right.
And the path forward, as you well know, the path forward from that idea, even if you can get initial funding, right? The path forward from that idea to market and then market success,
right?
Is strewn with very large boulders. And so just helping people understand, right, that there's nothing more dangerous than an entrepreneur that's just gotten their first flush of capital. Nothing. And so it's, just trying to help them work their way through that, right, to the point where they can begin to target what they need to target, right, and make choices about that. So that I love that, doing that work. But then I started working some on communications, mostly because I was really interested in messaging and the role that it can have. And again, this is just before social media. I did a lot of research on the American public. I published a couple of studies, one called the Market Study for Space Exploration, basically asking a lot of questions, in-depth interviews with 1,000 people on kind of what they thought about the space program. I did research on 18 to 25-year-olds. I was just really interested in kind of how they were seeing things. And my second or third paper, I don't remember, that was published on that cohort actually came out in 2008, which is about when Twitter hit. I was an early adopter. I think I adopted in late 7 or 08. And so it's been very interesting to sort of watch the rise of social media and the effect that it's had on all of this. But my consulting firm was me largely balancing business interests, meaning, make money, pay bills,
right,
with my own sense, sort of listening to my voice inside about what is the landscape as I see it, and where do I think I can have influence to help get the ball down the road, or down the field, mixing metaphors, get the ball down the field. And then trying to make choices about, essentially, I've always seen myself as a piece on my own chessboard. So trying to make choices about how to deploy myself to sort of help that happen. So that's what I continued doing until 4 years ago. And then I got asked to do this job.
Well, so tell me about this job. I was just going to ask about the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration.
So the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, So one of the ironies of it was that I was not a fan of it, which I'm sure will offend people who have been in it from the beginning. And I don't mean to be offensive of it. Part of it is I really didn't know very much about it, but it seemed to me that it was, and this is what it was a communications channel that was focused essentially almost exclusively on SLS and Orion. And the reason for doing that was the companies that were doing it. It had actually originally been created as the Coalition for Space Exploration during the era of Constellation, which was a program that was sort of born under George Bush, that was going to go back to the moon. Okay, and so there's a lot of focus on just sort of advancing those programs, and then of course we all know Constellation was canceled, and then sort of kind of reborn, although then it was revectored to Mars, and now it's been, revectored. And it was evident to everybody, I think, certainly not me, but just me, but everyone, that, continuity is important in any long lead time program. And it doesn't make any difference if it's in space or in defense or in civil engineering, or you pick it, it doesn't matter. And so continuity is just very, 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 very important. And so someone from one of those companies basically approached me and said, if you had this, what would you do with it? And I said, like, totally overhaul it. And they said, like, what? I said, well, look, so the world's changing, right? And we have a lot of players now coming into this because technology has sort of filtered its way down. I said it's much, much more acceptable. And then we have like venture capital. All right. And so that's what's really changing the world. And it is to everyone's benefit that people are engaged in this whole effort of space, right? It's to everyone's benefit. So if we're serious about leading, okay, then we have to lead that. I mean, that's what it is. It's space exploration and science and commerce writ large. And so, yeah, I'm deeply invested in the idea of a national program for a whole lot of reasons. Okay. So absolutely, I will promote these. Okay. But I will not just promote these. Okay. We need to be talking about how commerce plays a role. We need to talk about how exploration and science have synergistic interests. Okay. Not across the board. All right. But where they do, we really need to be talking about that. Okay. We need to be talking about how these programs actually are useful to enable, okay, economic development in space. Space station being the key, so here's this program that I'm still, to the day I die, will have been hugely proud to have worked on, okay, and contributed to. But I really remember, okay, 10 years of it's stupid, it's an albatross. There's still people that feel that way, okay. And it's the springboard for development of I don't know how many companies, okay, in low Earth orbit who are trying to figure out, can we use microgravity for processes or products or goods or services, or how do we do it, right? Springboard for that. Without station, we wouldn't have any of that. We wouldn't have the 103 plus countries that we have that are now playing in space. But I remember more than a decade, okay, of just like, oh my gosh, we need to sink it. We need to kill it. Survive by one vote in Congress at one point. Okay. So I've been here before. Okay. Is kind of how I feel. And so how would we use the coalition to essentially tell that story? And I said, and if I can get agreement, okay, from y'all's companies that this is a story worth telling, then I'll consider it. It was just a communications outlet. So I said, it needs to be a standalone. It needs to turn into a no-kidding nonprofit. It needs to be stood up. It needs to have a board of directors. It needs to be institutionalized. So I've started 3 companies by then. I had started 2 other technology companies by then. Okay, so it was like, so I've got to, it's what it needs, okay, and it needs to be a not-for-profit, and we need to sort of figure out. So I eventually took the job and spent the first 3 years doing that, okay, right? Because you've sort of been down this road, and that's how long it takes. And I told everybody, I said, it will be 3 years, okay, and I was like, it was almost to the week, okay, that I said that I filed the last piece of paper, and got it stood up, and we've built it out since then. And so when I took it, it was 5 companies, and it's now 70. The companies are the big primes, so Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, which just, as you know, acquired Orbital ATK, Aerojet Rocketdyne, but we also have some big mid-size. Actually, it depends on how you look at them in space. They're just big for me. They're so Honeywell, okay, some others. But the majority of our members are actually small companies, which I have a warm spot for, right?
Yeah.
And then we have, and a lot of them are built around technology, development and delivery. We've got mid-size like Moog and just, this sort of, but, and then we have new space companies. So we have NanoRacks and we have Main Space and we have Cislunar Space Development Company and we have, several others. But one interesting thing that I was talking about, and this thing I'm just watching with great joy, is that when I took the job and we started building up the companies, about 30%, now I'm not including the primes because they've always been doing business across the entire sector, social media notwithstanding. But the smaller companies, about 30% of them were doing business across the entire sector. Now 80% of them are doing business across the entire sector, which for me talks to me about what's happening in the sector, right? So that you're seeing more and more what I have been working to see and trying to support, which is from a business point of view, we look around the entire landscape and we say, gee, I think I want to go do this. This fits with my corporate agenda. This is sort of fits with our strategic plan. We're really, really good here and here. It would be great if we could find other companies that have these capabilities. So how do we figure out what our teaming looks like? And for those of you that don't do business, there's a whole thing called a gap analysis. Okay, where you go in and figure all this out. Okay, but you sort of identify who candidates might be for you to team with based on how you can put together the best possible team, you think, right? And over the last 6 months, we've seen Northrop Grumman and NanoRacks. We've seen Boeing and Virgin Galactic. We've seen Blue, Lockheed, Northrop, and Draper. We've seen, right? And there's more and more of this because what's finally happening is what's always happened in business, okay, is that companies are sort of saying, where do these capabilities lie? How can we put together teams that we think are useful to us? Okay. And again, get the ball down the field. So really what the coalition is about, okay, is supporting the national programs as enablers, okay, for all the rest of this other stuff to happen. And then trying to help that other stuff happen. So we try to help our businesses like make these kinds of connections.
Yeah, one of the things that's very unique about the space industry is the government customer. I've yet to seen a space startup that can survive without some sort of government contracting. And that is very unique to this industry. How much of the support and building of this industry has actually fallen out of these government programs?
See, I think it's maybe unique to this industry at this point in time, but I don't think it's unique to this industry. And so I'll push back a little bit. We are all trapped by our historic view, which tends to be centered in where we are right now. Yeah. But if you go and you look at transportation, I'll just pick transportation. If you just go and look at transportation, and I'm just going to talk about in the United States, if you look at that, the railroads, okay, were essentially created in part through partnerships between people who were trying to develop this relatively new technology. Not all that new actually, but there's some version of it goes back to Roman times. But they were doing that hand in hand with land grant, which is really how they got it. And the government was one of the initial major customers for the railroads. Same was true for the airlines, right? I mean, what became airlines, right? And we have the story about sort of the mail contracts, that sort of went early. And I don't think there's direct analogies, okay, between these things, but I think the government's always played a role, or maybe almost always played a role in the development of those kinds of capabilities. So here and now, it may be unique to space, but I think in the past we've kind of seen it. But to your point, the one of the things I become very frustrated about is people sort of say, well, the United States just needs to sort of hand over everything to entrepreneurs or commercial companies and there's a lot of reasons not to do that. The primary one, in my view, especially with regard to transportation systems, is geopolitical. But just from a purely financial point of view, the way the government works and has worked since 1778, okay, actually 76 was the Second Continental Congress, but the notion that congressmen and women bring back economic value to their region, okay, was in the founders, okay, thinking about how you keep representatives engaged, okay, in the business of the nation. And people may not like it, okay, and it tends to be dismissed as pork. But the fact of the matter is it's one of the engines that sort of underlies this system. And so I think to dismiss it as something that's new is to not know your history. And to dismiss it as something that's specific to space is to not know your history. And so the real question is, without national programs, would you continue to have that kind of engagement and that kind of investment? And the answer is no. And so those companies who are trying to build a portfolio, and I would urge any company to build a portfolio so that it's not overly reliant upon one sector, but it's typical for companies to start focusing in one sector and then expand to adjacent sectors. That's kind of how it works. And so you're right. A lot of, if not most of, if not all of, businesses that start in space are targeting or acquiring or somehow after or operating on, government funding. Yeah. And that's fine. That's I think that's an awesome thing about what the government programs have been able to do.
So what advice would you give a woman who's trying to break into the space industry, whether she wants to come in on the government side or the entrepreneur side? What advice would you give on how to break in?
One is calibrate your expectations accordingly. It is still a hugely male-dominated enterprise. Depending on the men you're engaging with, some of them are going to be supportive. Some of them are going to be neutral. Some of them are going to try to undercut you. And there are some specific issues that have to do with gender. There's a tendency to dismiss technical capabilities. So, for example, for many, many years, after I had moved into sort of comms and messaging strategy and then policy, people who only knew me with that sort of part of my life, which actually came pretty late, okay, I had several instances where people would sort of say, oh, well, if you really understood. And I was like, yeah, okay. So starting about when I took this job, because I hadn't had to do it like before then really, but when I started taking this job, I started reminding people of what I had done on station. And periodically, or given the opportunity to do on station, and periodically would give a lecture that, for example, I gave one 2 years ago at AIAA, where I said, okay, now we're going to talk about the business case that's required to close on reusability. And it doesn't make any difference who you are, okay, or what company you have, okay, or these are the nuts and bolts, right? People have looked at this for years and you can distill it down to, depending on which equation you use, 7 variables or 5 variables. Here's how these play out technically. And then I showed the statistics on launch, okay, and I sort of did all that. And it was very interesting because I had a couple of people come up to me afterwards who only knew me sort of in this other capacity and say, oh, I had no idea you knew all that. And it was fascinating, okay, for me to sort of, and interesting enough, their interactions with me after that changed. So then they would start asking questions about, and these were folks in the press actually, and they would start asking questions behind the scenes in terms of like, well, you can explain to us why it's important to aggregate a payload versus not, things
right.
like, so having technical skill, whether it's in engineering or in science or in business, okay, because I think about, being really good at business development is a technical skill. Yeah. Having those kinds of skills is absolutely critical for a woman in particular, because at some point, believe me, you're going to have to put maybe more than one, lots of times more than one. You're going to have to put your bona fides on the table and say, wait a minute.
Right.
And being able to do that, okay, is very, very important. It's also, by the way, why I got a PhD. And actually, it was my mentor who he passed just a couple of years ago, and who's a sort of, I used to say it was raised by wolves. My PhD committee was absolutely vicious, to my everlasting gratitude. I could get away with nothing, and that's how it should be. And he's the one that came into his office at one point and said, "You have to change your name." And I said, what? And he said, you have to change your name. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, you need to put the doctor in front of your name. And I said, why? And he said, because based on the kinds of things that you're saying that you want to do, it's going to matter. And it's particularly going to matter for you because you're a woman. Now, it's interesting to me because, you could get in trouble for saying things like that. But it was some of the straightest talk I ever got. And it was awesome. Okay. And I sat back and looked around and decided he was absolutely right. So I'm not saying everybody has to go get a PhD. Okay. But get your credentials. Okay. If you have an opportunity to do some sort of what I'll call technical development writ large. Okay, go ahead and do it because it's not fair, but all of the data that we have shows that women need to be more credentialed, need to be more capable, and need to work twice as hard, okay, in order to be able to get. So if you want to do it, then you best understand, okay, that you need to calibrate your expectations and recognize that that's what you're going to have to do. And it will take sacrifice, absolutely will take sacrifice.
I decided to start using the MBA after my name for very similar reasons.
Right.
As I got out into the workforce, it just wasn't necessarily always taken seriously. And then you put that comma MBA at the back of your name and all of a sudden people treat you differently. They really do. Right. They absolutely do. So I get it.
Yeah, I know you do. I know. It's been awesome to watch you develop too. It's just been awesome.
Oh, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
So have you had any specific challenges working in the space industry, being a woman? Anything that you've come across that's really kind of stopped you in your tracks?
I'm not the kind of person that walks around. I am a feminist. I absolutely am a feminist. And let me be clear how I define that. Okay. How I define feminism is someone who challenges societal roles that are constructed solely on the basis of gender. I also challenge societal roles that are constructed on the basis of religion or on the basis of racial background or ethnic identity, or it doesn't matter to me. Okay. Right. But that's how I define, feminist. And so that said, I don't run around with a chip on my shoulder, always looking for that. I'm not always looking for sexism. I'm always looking for gender. I'm not someone who considers myself to be hypersensitive or likely to fly off the handle. I, in fact, try to pride myself on being relatively even-handed and sort of the voice of reason, right? Because I'm much more interested in arguments that are based on rationality and data. So that said, so maybe because of that, there have been some instances and sort of events that occurred that always just my jaw drops, right? Where it hadn't happened for a while. This is one thing I would say to women. There's a bias in the society about women getting older, right? No, if you need to flip that around. The longer you stay, okay, and the more you succeed, the more you know where the bodies are buried. And you should not hesitate to let people know, okay, that you've been around long enough that you know where the bodies are buried, okay? And my experience is that has worked to my advantage. So every year I get older, for me, this is just awesome, okay? So let me just say that. Yeah, so let me just say that. But I can remember one instance where I was in a meeting. So I was, first of all, only woman in the room a lot. Yeah. And it really makes me sad when I hear women now saying that. Young women coming to me and saying, I'm very often the only woman in the room. I was the only woman in the room for the first time when I joined Boeing in 96 or 97 in a purely engineering environment. In 96 and 97. This is 2019. When I still hear women saying, I'm the only woman in the room, I feel very isolated. It just makes me sad because we haven't moved nearly as quickly as we need to move. Yeah. And so I really try to help young women a lot with that. But I remember one particular instance that I was actually in a meeting that had to do with military program. And we talked about technology. And at the end, the guy who was leading business development said, well, ladies, one woman in the room, well, ladies, okay, do we hike up our shirts and pull down our skirts and go get this contract? And of course, every head turns toward the one woman in the room. And I sat there for a second and I felt myself starting to get red. I was embarrassed. Yeah. But then I thought, well, I won't repeat what I thought, but you can imagine, it's 2 words. And I stood up and grabbed my shirt, okay, and pulled it up to about bra height and looked around the room. And I have never seen so many men push back from a conference table so fast, like in rapid time, okay, like defying the laws of physics, okay, and looking down, looking anywhere but. And I looked around the room and I went, questions? And then I sat back down. And I can recall the meeting broke up. And sort of already then, right? And the meeting broke up. And by the time I had made it back to my desk, my manager was waiting and sort of trying not to lose it laughing. Okay. Because I had a great manager. Okay. And he said, and we started talking about it and explain it. Okay. And at the end, he's going, I get where you're at, you know?
Yeah.
But maybe next time, point taken.
Yeah.
Right. I can remember several times being asked to get coffee, both in academia and in industry and as a consultant. I mean, sort of it hasn't mattered if I was near a coffee pot or near an executive's desk, okay, having somebody who didn't know who I was come up and, hey, dear, can you get, to which my response was always, it's Dr. Dear. And the coffee is down there, right?
There you go.
Help yourself. And so those kinds of things, they haven't happened to me recently.
And that's good. That's encouraging,
That's
right?
encouraging.
Yeah.
But they happened to me for off and on for 25 years. And I just learned you have two choices. You can either internalize this stuff, feel bad about yourself, feel aggrieved about the circumstances that you're in, whine, okay? Or you can develop some shielding, okay, and some armor. And I always tried to do it with some humor.
Right.
And because frankly, that's just a calculation. I'm less likely to antagonize people. There's still going to be some who are going to be antagonized. I can't do anything about it. Okay. But also it's good for me. Okay. You know, to sort of have some humor about it, and then find women who will, women and men, not just women, but women in particular, who will sort of join with you to support these kinds of things, right? So that you're not isolated, you're not alone. You know, you do reach out to mentors, and those mentors can be male or female, who you know are going to be supportive to you.
Wonderful. Yeah. Wonderful. So, I find that most of the people who are really in the space world are kind of true believers, right? It becomes a part of who you are in every way. So tell me a little bit about, outside of your kind of day job at the Coalition, what are some other things that you're passionate about that you work on that are helping moving the space movement forward?
That's a good question, because my job feels... So I'm on the Space Studies Board. I don't know if this is the kind of thing you're asking for or not, but I'm on the Space Studies Board for the National Academies, which I am honored to serve on, and I'm going into my 5th year on. Third term. I thought I was going to do 2, but I've decided to do 3. Mostly because I'm so engaged with it. And the Space Studies Board oversees what are called the decadal surveys that a lot of people are unaware of. But those surveys are a once every 10 years gathering of the scientific community where it sort of assigns priorities for space science missions. And that's a way for me to continue. That's all pro bono work, right? I mean, like everyone. Right. But that's a way for me to continue sort of keeping my eye on what's going on in the science, and also trying to help the country think through, you know. And then I'm also serve on the Users Advisory Group to the National Space Council that I was appointed to last year. And that's also an opportunity to sort of think about how do you leverage a whole of government approach to address some issues that are affecting the space enterprise. So here's an example that's a very technical one and not, okay, which is spectrum, which is essentially how we allocate the radio frequencies. Everyone is dependent upon this. And what's the governance model inside the U.S., and is that working for us in the U.S.? That's an example. Economic development of space is another one, right? I mean, how do we think about how we're going to go forward with that? And then the third thing I do in my spare time is I serve on the Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee for the FAA. So all of those are volunteer. They're just ways that I try to sort of, and again, I'm honored to serve on all of them. And between that and then sort of representing the slice of industry that I do, it gives me a vision of kind of what the enterprise looks like. That is very helpful, I think, to me to sort of help people think about strategy moving forward. But the other thing I do that I love to do is I still do a lot of mentoring. I spend a lot of time with young people, women in particular, but not only, trying to help them think about how you chart a career and sort of how do you deal with these obstacles, and trying to help them formulate goals, also with the knowledge that goals can be flexible over time.
Right.
Just trying to help people think about how do I find my way, and how do I, and introducing them into other networks. And so that's something I spend time on that I really value.
I love that. It's I spend a lot of time as well. I kind of anytime somebody hits me up on LinkedIn that's a young professional or a student, I always try and spend that time, and it is more rewarding for me, I think. Even though I think I'm helping them, I think it's even more rewarding for me.
I get a lot out of this. Yeah.
All right. So last question that we ask everybody. When it comes time to actually go and settle space, will you be among the first to go?
No, because it will not happen in my lifetime.
You don't think so?
No.
Oh.
The distances are enormous. Okay, even if we go to the moon and start there, it's a few miles.
Yeah.
230,000. It is an environment that human beings did not evolve to survive in. And what that means is that we have to evolve our technology in order to be able to enable us to do that. And settlement to me, is you have some sort of community, even if it's very small, that is working toward, will not initially be self-sustaining at all, but is like working toward being self-sustaining, and is sort of creating the social and governance structures that are necessary in order to be able to do all of that. It's going to require the habitat that allows them to create those social and governance structures. It's going to have the means to survive. We're going to have a very active transportation system that's going back and forth, and a big transportation model that's going to be bigger and much more expensive than anybody. Forget government, forget commercial. I mean, just big and expensive. And we haven't solved some basic problems yet. Like, what do we do with the dust if we're just on the moon, right? And then we go to Mars, and there's a whole other set of dust problems. So I'm 62. Okay. I hope to live to the point where I'm planning to live to the point where we have regular activity there. And we have people busily prospecting and trying to figure out what they can do with the resources that are there. And we have scientists all over the place trying to figure out, to learn as much as they possibly can from the moon, which has been called the Rosetta Stone for the whole, solar system. So we'll have people all over the place trying to explore. And if all that happens in my lifetime, I'm going to consider myself done. Okay. It's like, I helped get the ball down the field. If we're to the point where we've got some early folks there that are sort of trying to figure out all the rest of that kind of stuff, then, I think that's awesome. But for me, that's icing. I really do think, I think it'll happen, but I do think the timelines involved in developing the systems and getting the systems down there and getting people down there and, establishing all that, I think it's much longer than some of us would like to believe. Maybe I'm missing the boat. I hope so. But that's how I see it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today,
Thank
Mary
you
Lynne.
for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure.
Always awesome to see you, Megan.
You too.
Okay.
Mission Eve is a production of the Center for Space, Commerce, and Finance, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to educating entrepreneurs and investors about their respective challenges and opportunities as it relates to space. Megan Crawford has been your host and executive producer. Aaron Pagel is the executive director for the center and producer and editor for this episode. Marketing and communications for Mission Eve is managed by Nikki Martinez. Theme music has been composed by Liz Fole. If you'd like to support this podcast, please visit patreon.com/missioneve to become a monthly subscriber. We have multiple tiers available with benefits like personalized thank yous, access to limited edition t-shirts, opportunities to engage with our interviewees via online Ask Me Anything sessions, and small group gatherings with Megan Crawford when available. Any support you can offer will go a long way to helping us continue to tell the stories of the women who are making life in space a reality. Please follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Center for Space, Commerce, and Finance, Twitter at CSCF_nonprofit, and LinkedIn at linkedin.com/company/CSCF. Thank you very much for listening.